She stepped down off the stage with a derringer in her sleeve and a wedding dress folded in a flour sack, and she did not look like a woman who had come to be loved. I've buried 16 men in this valley. I keep a ledger of everyone's names, debts, the weather, the day we put them down. I am not a man who startles, but when that bride looked up from under her travel-stained bonnet and her eyes went straight past the man who'd paid her passage and landed on the big white house on the hill, something cold walked up the back of my neck and sat there. She had not come west to marry. She had come to settle a bill nobody else knew was owed. And the man waiting for her on that hill, the richest man in 3 counties, the man whose handshake I'd trusted for 11 years, was about to learn that the lie he'd buried so carefully had grown a daughter, and a sister, and a memory longer than the prairie itself. This is the story of the spring the cattle came home, and the truth came with them. I was there for all of it. God help me, I was there. The morning she arrived, the wind came off the flats carrying the smell of wet sage and the particular dust that gets into a man's teeth and stays there till supper. I remember because I'd been counting it as a bad luck day before she ever stepped down. My knee told me weather was coming. My knee is never wrong, which is more than I can say for the rest of me. I'd driven the buckboard into Coltrane Bend to fetch the new wife. That was the word old Halloran used, the new wife, like a man might say the new mare or the new branding iron, an item ordered and paid for and now arriving by stage. He hadn't come himself. Halloran didn't come down off his hill for women or weather. He'd sent me, because I was the one who didn't talk back and didn't talk much at all, and a man wants neither when he's buying a stranger to fill his dead wife's chair. So I sat on the bench outside the freight office with my hat pulled low, and I watched the stage rock in over the rise with its team lathered and its driver cursing, and I told myself this was a small errand and I'd be home before the rain. The other passengers came down first, a drummer with a sample case and a sweat ring under each arm, a widow in mourning black who looked like she'd been mourning so long she'd forgotten the man's name, a boy traveling alone, eyes big as dollars. Then her. She paused at the top of the little iron step the way some folks do when they've ridden too long and their legs have quit believing in solid ground. One gloved hand on the doorframe, the other holding a flour sack against her chest like it carried something breakable. She wore a gray traveling dress gone brown at the hem and a bonnet that had once been a respectable blue. Her face, when she lifted it, was younger than I'd braced for, maybe 25, but there was nothing young in the way she looked at the world. She looked at it the way I look at a horse I don't trust, measuring, waiting for the kick. "You'll be Halloran's man," she said, not a question. "Cassius," I said, "cast to most. I drive for the Bar H." "You drive the wife home, do you?" Something dry under it, not quite mockery, closer to a person testing whether you'd flinch. "Today I do." She came down the last step on her own, refusing the hand I half offered out of 40 years of habit. When her boots hit the boards I heard it, a small, wrong weight shift, the way a man carries himself when he's got iron in his belt and isn't used to the heft of it yet. I felt that hitch in my own walk plenty. I knew it the way you know your own name. This woman was armed. Now a woman traveling alone across that country had every reason in the world to carry. I'd have thought less of her if she didn't. So I said nothing, and I loaded her trunk, a small thing, lighter than a dead woman's hatbox, and I helped her up onto the bench, and I clucked the team into the long road home. For 2 miles she didn't speak. I'd decided she was the silent kind and was grateful for it. Then she said, looking straight out at the road, "Tell me about him." "Mr. Halloran." "My husband." She said the word the way you'd handle a snake you weren't sure was dead. I considered what a man ought to say. I've worked for Tobias Halloran 11 years. He pulled me out of a bottle when I had nowhere left to fall and gave me a bunk and a wage and a reason to stand up mornings. He built the Bar H out of nothing but nerve and other men's land, and there are things about how he did it that I'd boxed up and stacked in a back corner of myself and never opened, because a man's got to live, and living means not looking at every shadow. He's a hard man, I said finally. Fair mostly, pays what he owes, doesn't drink, doesn't gamble, doesn't suffer fools. I paused. His first wife died of fever 3 winters back. He grieved her in his way. He's been looking for a woman to run the house since. To run the house, she gave a small sound that wasn't a laugh. Is that what I'm for? I couldn't say what you're for, ma'am. That's between you and him. She turned and looked at me then, full on, and I'll tell you it was like being looked at by something older than she was. You're an honest man, Cass, she said. That's a misfortune in your line of work. I didn't have an answer for that. I clucked the team on and let the wind do the talking. We came over the last rise an hour before noon, and the whole valley opened up the way it does, the cottonwoods green along the creek, the great spread of grass running gold to the foothills, and the cattle on it, hundreds of head wearing the bar H, fat and slow and worth a fortune. And up on the rise, white as a bone in the sun, the big house. 2 stories, glass windows shipped from St. Louis, a porch you could dance on. The kind of house that says to every poor soul who rides past, I won. You didn't. Keep moving. I watched her face when she saw it. I've learned to watch faces. Words lie, but faces are slow. She didn't gasp. She didn't soften. Her jaw set just slightly, the way a fighter's does at the bell, and her eyes went narrow and hot and then very, very still. And she said, so quiet I almost lost it under the wheels. So that's where the money went. I didn't know what she meant. I told myself I didn't want to. Halloran was waiting on the porch. He was a big man even at 60, broad through the chest, white-headed, with a way of standing that took up more room than his body did. He wore a black coat, though it was warm, because a rich man wears what he likes and lets the rest of us sweat. He came down the steps as we pulled up, and he looked the bride over the way he'd look over stock at auction, quick, total, pricing her, and then he smiled, and the smile was warm, and that was the thing about Tobias Halloran that took men years to understand. The warmth was real. He could mean it and use it in the same breath. Mrs. Halloran, he said before she was even down, claiming her with the name. You're prettier than the photograph. I'm a lucky old man. She let him hand her down. I noticed that. She'd refused me, a hired driver, but she let him take her hand, and she smiled up at him, a soft, shy, becoming smile. And it was such a perfect smile that I, who'd watched her not smile for 10 miles, felt the hair stand up on my arms. She was good. Whatever she was good at it. I hope I'll suit, she said, and her voice had gone girlish, gone gentle, all the dry edges sanded off. I've come such a long way. You'll suit fine. He tucked her hand into his arm. Cass, see to her trunk. Maria's got dinner. We'll have the preacher up Sunday and do it proper. He patted her hand. No sense rushing a lady. No sense at all, she agreed. They went up the steps together, the cattle baron and his armed bride, and I stood by the buckboard with the flour sack she'd forgotten, or hadn't forgotten. I'd come to learn she forgot nothing, and I felt the rain my knee had promised begin to come in off the flats, a soft gray curtain dragging across the grass toward us. I should have left the sack on the bench. I'm not a man who pries. But it had fallen open in the jolting, and inside, folded careful as a flag, was the wedding dress, white once, yellowed now, mended at the cuff in tiny stitches by somebody who'd loved it. And tucked into the folds, where a woman might hide a thing she meant to keep close, was a daguerreotype in a dented brass case. I shouldn't have looked, I looked. It was a young man, 20 maybe, laughing, the way the old pictures almost never caught because you had to hold so still, but somebody had caught this one laughing, head tipped, and you could see he'd been the kind of boy a room got brighter for. On the back, scratched in a girl's hand. Daniel gone west spring of 71, bar H. I stood in the first of the rain with that picture in my hand, and I felt the back corner of myself. The backstep part come open all on its own. Because I remembered Daniel. I'd best tell it the way it happened, even the parts I'd rather not. 11 years back when I first came to the bar H, The spread was half what it is now. Halloran had grass but no water rights worth the name, and a man with cattle and no water is a man on borrowed time. East of us, along the only good creek for 20 miles, ran a little outfit, a quarter-section homestead worked by a family named Reese. Father, a daughter back east somewhere, and a son. The son had come out to prove the claim. Young, green as April. Worked that ground like it owed him something. And it did, in the way land owes the people who break their hands on it. The boy's name was Daniel Reese. I didn't know him well. Cowhands and homesteaders don't mix easy, but I'd traded a few words with him at the bend. He'd bought me a beer once when my horse threw a shoe and I was waiting on the smith, and he'd talked the whole hour about the orchard he meant to plant and the sister he meant to send for once the house was built. He had plans stacked up like cordwood, that boy. More plans than a single life could hold. The creek ran through his quarter section before it ever reached our grass. You can see, can't you, where this goes? I could see it then. I just didn't let myself. There was a dispute over water rights. There's always a dispute over water rights. It's the one thing out here worth dying over, and men do. Halloran offered to buy the Reese claim. The boy wouldn't sell, it wasn't his to sell, he said. It was his father's name on the deed and his sister's future in the soil. Words went back and forth. Lawyers in the county seat. And then one night in the fall of '72, there was a fire. The Reese place burned to the dirt. The boy was inside. They called it an accident. A knocked-over lamp, a dry season, a sleeping man. Coroner up from the county seat signed it in an afternoon. With Daniel dead and the father 1,000 miles east and too old to come, the claim went a tax default inside a year, and the Bar H bought it at auction for back taxes, fair and legal. Every stamp in order, and with it came the creek, and with the creek came everything. The grass we ran cattle on this morning. The house with the St. Louis glass. All of it stood on that water. I never saw Halloran light a match. I want that understood. I never saw a thing I could swear to. But I saw 2 of his men ride out late that night and come back smelling of coal oil and not meeting anybody's eye. And I saw Halloran pay them a bonus the next week he called hazard wages. And I saw the way he never once, in 11 years, spoke the boy's name. And I'd boxed it up. Told myself I didn't know. Told myself a man can't be sure, and what isn't sure isn't his to carry. I'd taken my wage off that grass for 11 years and slept fine most nights, and the nights I didn't sleep I told myself were just my knee. Now here was the boy's face in my hand, laughing, and up in the White House his sister was eating dinner with the man who'd bought her brother's bones for back taxes, and smiling at him, soft and shy, with iron under her sleeve. The rain came down in earnest. I put the picture back in the dress and folded the dress back in the sack, and I stood there a long while letting myself get wet. The way you do when getting wet is the only honest thing left. I carried the sack up to the house and gave it to Maria for the bride's room, and I did not say a word about what was in it. I want to be clear that I made a choice right there on the back stairs with the rain running off my hat. I could have gone to Halloran. Tobias, this woman is Daniel Reese's sister. She's come for blood. Send her back before the preacher comes. That would have been the loyal thing. 11 years of bunk and wage and a reason to stand up mornings. That's what loyalty costs, and I'd have been paying what I owed. I didn't do it. I told myself it was because I wasn't sure. But that was the old lie, the boxed-up lie, and I was getting too old to keep paying its freight. The truth was simpler and worse. The truth was that some part of me, some part I'd sat on for 11 years, wanted to see what she'd do. Supper that night I ate in the cookhouse with the hands like always, and through the rain I could see the lit windows of the big house, gold squares in the gray, and once a shadow crossed her shadow, I thought, moving slow through Halloran's rooms, learning the house, counting the doors. A woman doesn't come 1,000 miles for revenge and rush it. She lays it down careful, the way she'd laid that wedding dress in its sack. White for the wedding. White for the boy she dressed for burial in her mind 100 times and never got to bury at all. I thought about her smile on the porch. I hope I'll suit. And I understood, chewing beans I couldn't taste, that the most dangerous thing about her wasn't the derringer in her sleeve. It was that she could go gentle. She could go soft and shy and sweet and hold it for as long as it took, and never once let the hate show in her face. And a person who can do that, who can carry a fire that hot behind a face that still, is capable of patience the rest of us can't imagine. I'd been impatient with my own conscience for 11 years and lost. She'd been patient with hers across a continent and a dead brother, and she hadn't lost. She'd just arrived. The rain quit near midnight. I couldn't sleep, my knee, I told myself. The old lie one more time, so I went out to check the horses, and that's when I saw her. She was on the porch of the big house in a dark wrapper, no lamp, just standing at the rail looking out at the black shape of the land. She'd taken off the bonnet. Her hair was down, and she wasn't soft now, wasn't shy. In the dark with nobody to perform for, her whole body had gone hard and straight as a fence post, and she was looking at that grass, at her brother's grass, at the water that had cost him his life, with a stillness that frightened me more than any weeping would have. I don't know what made me do it. Loyalty to Halloran said walk away. 40 years of minding my own said walk away. But I'd carried that boy's face up the stairs that afternoon, and something in me had come unboxed and wouldn't go back. I crossed the yard, stopped at the bottom of the steps, took off my hat because some things you do bareheaded. She didn't startle. She'd heard me coming, of course she had. Nothing got past her. She just looked down at me from the rail and waited. I knew your brother, I said. The land was very quiet. Somewhere out on the flats, a coyote tried a note and gave it up. For a long moment she didn't move. Then her hand drifted, slow, toward the fold of her wrapper, and I knew the derringer was there, and I knew she was deciding whether I was a thing to be dealt with. Daniel bought me a beer once, I said, keeping my voice low and even the voice you use on a spooked horse. At the bend, talked my ear off about an orchard, apple trees, he said his sister liked apples. I turned my hat in my hands. I don't know what you came to do, ma'am. I expect I can guess. I just want you to know before you do whatever it is that not everybody on this hill forgot his name. One of us remembered. I'm sorry it took your face to make me say it out loud. Her hand stopped, came away from the wrapper, slow, empty. When she spoke, her voice had lost the girl entirely, lost the dry traveler too, and what was left underneath was just a tired and terrible thing, a grief worn down to wire. His name was Daniel Reese, she said. He was 19. He wrote me every month and the letters stopped in October, and the last one said the cattleman was making trouble. She looked back out at the grass. It took me 11 years to get here, Cass. I buried my father waiting. I scrubbed floors and I taught school and I answered a marriage advertisement from the one man in this country I have ever wanted to kill, and I came west in a dead boy's wedding dress because I had nothing else white to wear. Her jaw worked. Tell me you'll stand aside. That's all I want from you, just stand aside. The coyote tried its note again. Out past the cottonwoods the creek ran on in the dark, carrying its water down to grass that wasn't ever rightly Halloran's, and I stood at the bottom of the steps of the house that water built, an old man who'd kept a coward silence for 11 years, and I felt the whole weight of that silence come down on me at once. Ma'am, I said, there's things about that fire I never told a living soul. She went very still. I think, I said, and my voice wasn't steady now, wasn't a hoarse gentling voice at all. I think it's past time somebody did. The wind came up off the flats, cold and wet and smelling of sage, and high in the White House a lamp flared gold in an upstairs window, Halloran awake. Moving, and the bride and I both turned to look at it, and neither of us said a word. The lamp in the upstairs window moved, and then the front door opened, and Tobias Halloran came out onto his porch in his shirt sleeves with a pistol hanging easy from his hand. Cass, he said, mild, pleasant, even. It's an odd hour for a man to be standing in my yard with his hat off. I'd been caught at 100 things in my life and learned the trick of everyone say less, look stupider than you are. Let the other man fill the silence with his own guesses. But the bride was 3 feet above me on the steps, and her brother's face was still warm in my memory, and the old tricks felt like a coat I'd outgrown. Couldn't sleep, I said. Knee. Your knee. Halloran came to the rail easy, and the gun stayed pointed at nothing, which is how a careful man holds a gun when he's not yet decided who it's for. He looked at the bride. And you, Mrs. Halloran, the road tire you too much to lie down. I'm not used to so much quiet, she said, and just like that the girl was back in her voice, soft and a little lost, the performance dropping over her like a veil. Back east there's always a dog barking somewhere. Out here it's so still I can hear my own heart. I came out for the air. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering prettily. Cass startled me. I'm afraid I about screamed. He has that effect. Halloran's mouth curved. He believed her. Why wouldn't he? He'd bought a frightened girl by post, and a frightened girl was what stood before him, slim and shivering in the dark. He didn't know he'd bought a fuse. Go on in and warm up. Maria left the stove banked. I'll have a word with my driver and come up. She went. At the door she paused and looked back, not at Halloran, at me. One look, flat and fast as a card turned over, and the whole soft girl act wasn't anywhere in it. Stand aside, the look said. You promise me nothing yet. Don't promise him. Then the door closed, and it was Halloran and me and the gun. He waited until her step had faded up the stairs. Then the pleasantness went out of his face the way heat goes out of iron, slow and total, and what was left was the man who'd built all this. The man I'd worked for 11 years and never once seen lie, because he'd never once needed to lie to me. What were you saying to her? Nothing, boss. 11 years, Cass. He came down one step. I know the shape of your nothing, that wasn't it. You had your hat in your hands like a man at a graveside. His eyes moved over my face. What did you tell her? And here's where I'll set the truth down plain, because I've danced around my own cowardice long enough in this telling. I had a clean way out. All I had to say was I told her I knew her brother, a lie of omission, harmless, the kind I'd lived on for a decade. He'd have nodded and gone up to bed, and by Sunday the preacher would have come, and the thing would have played out however it was going to play out, with me a spectator the way I'd always been a spectator, hat in hand at the edge of other men's killings. Instead I said, you never told me she was Daniel Reese's sister. The night got very wide and very quiet. Halloran didn't move. That was the worst of it. A lesser man would have flinched, would have blustered, would have reached for the easy denial. Halloran just stood there on his step and let the name sit in the air between us, and I watched him do the arithmetic fast and cold, the same arithmetic he'd done over the water rights 11 years back. What does Cass know? What can Cass prove? What is Cass worth alive against what he costs me knowing? You went through her things, he said. The sack fell open in the buckboard. And you put a name to a face from a picture 11 years old. He almost smiled. You always did have a memory like a tax assessor. It's why I kept you. He came down the last step into the yard, into the wet, and now we stood eye to eye, two old men in the dark with one gun between us. All right, she's the Reese girl. I knew it when her letters came. She signed a married name, but the hand was the same as the boy's, looping on the R's. I'd seen it on the deed often enough. He shrugged, an enormous easy roll of those shoulders. I let her come anyway. That stopped me cold. You knew. Of course I knew. He said it the way you'd explain weather to a child. A loose end's only dangerous when it's somewhere you can't see it, Cass. The Reese girl back east, writing letters, asking questions, hearing some county lawyer one day to dig up an old fire, that's a loose end in the dark. The Reese girl out here in my house, eating my food, sleeping under my roof where I can watch her hands, he spread his own, that's a loose end I'm holding. You understand the difference. You've roped enough strays. I understood. God help me, it was the most Halloran thing I'd ever heard, and it was brilliant, and it was monstrous, and the two had never once been separate in him. He hadn't been fooled by her soft smile on the porch. He'd been letting her think she was fooling him. The cattle baron and his armed bride had ridden up that hill at noon, both believing they held the secret, and only one of them had been right. She came to kill you, I said. She came to try. He looked up at the lit kitchen window where her shadow moved against the curtain, banking the stove she'd been told to warm herself at. Pretty thing, tired thing. She's carried it 11 years, I can see it on her, the way you can see a horse that's been ridden too long by a fool. They get a look. She's all the way past grief and out the other side into the part where there's nothing left but the doing of the thing. He said it almost gently, almost like a man who admired it. I'll give her a few days. Let her settle. Let her think she's getting close. And then one morning she'll have a riding accident or the fever her predecessor had, and there'll be a small sad funeral in a county that's already used to the Bar H burying its women, and that, he said, will be the very last loose end on this whole spread, tied off for good. The wind moved the cottonwoods. Far off the creek ran on. I'm telling you this, Halloran went on, conversational, because I want you to do what you've always done, Cass, which is nothing. You're good at it. It's a gift. You stood at the edge of the last Reese business 11 years ago and you kept your mouth shut and your eyes down and you took your wage and you slept fine and you'll do it again. And in a month it'll be like she never got off the stage. He holstered the pistol. That was the insult of it. He holstered the gun because he decided I was no more a threat than a fence post. Won't you? And there it was. The whole of my life laid out in one question. Won't you? 11 years of bunk and wage and a reason to stand up mornings against a dead boy who'd bought me a beer and a living woman in a borrowed wedding dress who'd asked me for one thing only: stand aside. And I realized, standing in the wet dark with the smell of sage and the old man's certainty pressing down on me, that I couldn't even do that anymore. I couldn't stand aside. Standing aside was a kind of doing. I'd been doing it for 11 years, and it had a body count. No, I said. It came out small, it came out cracked, but it came out. Halloran's head tilted just slightly, the way it had over the water rights, the way it did at auction over a number he hadn't expected. Say again. I won't do nothing, not this time. My hands had started to shake and I let them. A man's allowed to shake when he's burning his own house down. I should have said something when the Reese place burned. I knew your men rode out with coal oil. I knew what hazard wages paid for. I've known 11 years and I took my money and I called it not being sure, and I'm an old man now, Tobias, and I'd like to die having said one true thing out loud before I go. I put my hat back on. The gesture steadied me, somehow covered head like a man going back to work. She's not having a riding accident, not while I draw breath. For a moment, I'll swear to this till they put me in my own ledger. For a moment something passed over Halloran's face that wasn't anger. It was almost grief. The grief of a man watching a useful tool turn in his hand and cut him, after 11 years of cutting only where he aimed it. That's a shame, he said quietly. I did like you, Cass. His hand moved back toward the holster. It would have ended there. I want that understood. I'd made my one true stand at 60-odd years of age, and it would have bought me exactly one bullet, and the ledger I keep would have had to wait for somebody else to write my name in it. Halloran's hand was on the gun and his eyes had gone flat and final, and I had no iron of my own. I'd come out to check horses, not to die. The kitchen door opened. I wouldn't, the bride said. She stood in the spill of lamplight with the derringer level in both hands, and she was not shivering now, and she was not soft, and the girl was gone so completely it was like she'd never existed. What stood there was the thing Halloran had named. A person all the way past grief and out the other side, with nothing left but the doing of the thing, and the doing was pointed at the back of his head from 12 feet, and her hands didn't shake at all. Step away from him, she said. Halloran didn't turn. He was too smart to turn. He stood with his hand on his holstered gun and his back to her derringer, and he did the arithmetic one more time, 2 barrels. She'll fire wide. She's never killed a man. The recoil will throw her. I can turn and draw before the second. I watched him do it. Watched him weigh his own death against her nerve, the way he'd weighed everything his whole life. You've been listening, he said. Since loose end, she said. I learned a long time ago to listen at doors in this country. It's the only way a woman hears the truth. Her voice was steady as a held note. You killed my brother for water. You said so just now, near enough. You'd have killed me by Friday, and you'd have killed this old man tonight for the crime of growing a conscience 11 years too late. Something flickered behind her eyes, not mercy, exactly. Something harder than mercy and more dangerous to her than to him. I came here to do this slow. I had it all planned. I was going to make you trust me. I was going to let you fall a little in love with your tired, pretty bride, and then I was going to take everything from you the way you took everything from us, the slow way, the patient way, watch it all burn down around you before the end. Her jaw worked. And now you've gone and made it simple. Now it's just a gun in the dark, same as you gave Daniel. I should thank you. You've saved me 11 years of being clever. Then do it, Halloran said. And here is the terrible truth of the man, he meant it. He turned his head slow, just enough to find her with one eye, and he wasn't afraid. He'd never once been afraid in his life. Fear was a thing that happened to the people he stood on. Go on, girl, pull it. You've come a long way for it. He smiled, and the smile was warm, real and warm, the same warmth he'd handed her on the porch at noon, because he could mean it and use it in the same breath always, right to the end. But you should know if you fire that, the county hangs you. I've got 11 years of being the richest man in 3 counties, and you've got a dead brother nobody remembers and a married name that isn't yours and a borrowed wedding dress in a flour sack. Who do you think they'll believe? Pull it, and you don't get justice. You get a rope, and I get to be a murdered husband, and your Daniel stays exactly as forgotten as he is right now. He spread his free hand. Or put it down, be my frightened bride, and maybe I let you live out the spring. It was the cruelest thing I ever heard a man say, and it was true, every word, and that's what made it cruel. He'd handed her her own helplessness wrapped up neat. Kill him and hang. Spare him and die slow. There was no third door. He'd built a life out of making sure there was never a third door for anybody but him. The derringer trembled, just once, the first crack I'd seen in her all day. And I stood between them, an old fool with his hat on and no gun, watching a boy's sister decide whether to spend her life on a bullet. And I understood that whatever happened in the next breath, I'd helped bring it here, with my 11 years of silence and my one late true word, and that I had no right any more to stand at the edge of it with my eyes down. So I stepped in front of him. I don't fully know why I did it. He was the guilty one. She was the wronged one. By every account that should have mattered, I should have let her fire and damn the consequences. But I'd spent my whole life standing aside while men like Halloran did their arithmetic, and I was done with the edges, and some animal part of me knew that if she pulled that trigger, she'd lose the rest of her life to a rope, and the boy who'd talked about apple trees wouldn't have wanted his sister hanged for the man who burned him. So I put my old body between the derringer and the cattle baron, and I held up my empty hands, and I said the truest thing I had left. Not like this. He's right that they'll hang you, and he's wrong that there's no other way, and I can prove he's wrong, but not if you put a ball through me to get to him. I was breathing hard. I rode with the men who burned the Reese place. I never lit it, but I know, and I'll swear it, and there's a thing I never told a soul, there's a paper. Halloran made the men sign for their hazard wages, a ledger line with their marks. I kept the book. I keep all his books. It's in the office safe not 40 feet from where you're standing, and it ties 2 living men to that fire by their own hands, and that, I said, is how you take everything from him the slow way, not a bullet, a courtroom. Put it down, ma'am. Let me get the book. The yard had gone so silent, I could hear the lamp gutter through the open door. Halloran behind me had gone very still, stiller than I'd ever felt him, because for the first time in 11 years, for the first time, maybe, in his whole armored life, Tobias Halloran had heard a number he hadn't expected, and the arithmetic wasn't coming out his way. There's no such ledger, he said, but the warmth was gone from his voice now. That's how I knew. Page 41, I said, fall of 72, hazard wages 2 hands by Mark. You signed under it yourself, boss. You always did insist on signing your own books. Said a man who won't put his name to his accounts is a man who's planning to lie about them. I almost laughed. It came out closer to a sob. It was the one honest habit you had, and it's going to hang you. The bride looked at me over the barrel of her derringer, and slow, so slow, the gun came down. But she didn't lower it because she believed me yet. I saw that. She lowered it because she decided in that long, terrible second that a ledger she could hold in her hands was worth more than a bullet she could put in his head. And that decision, the choosing of the patient ruin over the quick one, the choosing of her brother's name cleared in a courtroom over the easy animal satisfaction of his killer dead in the dirt, cost her more than firing ever would have. You could see it cost her. Her whole face shook with the cost of it. "Get the book," she said. I turned for the house. And that's when Halloran moved. Not for me, he'd given up on me. He went past me in a rush that no man that size and age has a right to, straight for the open kitchen door, for the office beyond it, for the safe, for page 41. And I understood in a flash of cold that the only copy of the only proof was 40 feet away in an unlocked house with the guilty man between it and us. And I just told him exactly where the rope was so he could go burn it the way he'd burned everything else. "The safe," I shouted. "He's going for the—" Behind me the derringer cracked once, enormous in the dark. The shot did not hit Halloran. I knew it before I turned, the way you know a thing in your body before your mind catches up. There was no grunt, no heavy fall, none of the wet sounds a ball makes when it finds a man. There was only the crack, and then the cattle baron still moving, his bulk filling the lit doorway, and a long curl of splintered wood spinning off the doorframe an inch from his head where the ball had buried itself. She'd missed. And I've turned this over 1,000 nights since, and I'm still not certain. She hadn't aimed to hit. 11 years she'd carried that hate, and she'd had him dead to rights, his back half turned, 12 feet of nothing between the muzzle and the base of his skull. A woman who could listen at doors and hold a soft smile across a continent does not jerk a trigger by accident. I think I'll never know, but I think that in the half-second between my shout and her shot, some last thread in her had held, that she'd fired to stop him and not to kill him, because killing him was the easy door, and she just decided, at terrible cost, to take the hard one. And then he'd moved, and the choice had nearly been made for her by her own hand, and the ball had gone an inch wide of settling everything. One ball, a derringer carries two. She had one left and Halloran knew it, and Halloran was already through the door. I went after him. I'm an old man and my knee is a liar and a curse, but I knew that house the way I knew my own hands, and he was running for the office in the dark with the panic of a man who has finally, after a lifetime, found something he cannot buy or burn or bury. He hit the office door with his shoulder. I hit it 2 seconds behind him. The bride came behind me, light and fast, the lamp from the kitchen swinging in her free hand and throwing our shadows huge and lurching up the walls. The safe stood in the corner, a great black Mosler he'd freighted in at scandalous expense, the kind of box that says a man has things worth locking. He was already crouched at the dial, and his thick fingers were spinning it. And here is the irony I've never gotten the bottom of. He knew the combination by heart, of course he did. It was his safe, but his hands were shaking. Tobias Halloran, whose hands had never once shaken in 11 years, not over water rights nor a burning homestead nor his first wife's grave, knelt at his own safe with everything depending on 6 turns of a dial, and he could not make his fingers obey. "Boss," I said. I was wheezing. The knee had given out and I'd caught the doorframe. "It's done. Walk away from it." "It's a ledger line." He didn't look up. The dial slipped under his sweat and he started over, cursing low. "It's a ledger line, Cass. It's nothing. It's 2 hands and a date. I'll burn it and it's their word against. There is no word. They're gone. Both of them moved on years back. It's nothing." He was talking to himself now, doing the arithmetic out loud for the first time in his life, and the arithmetic kept coming out wrong, and I think that was what was shaking his hands. Not fear of the rope. The strangeness of a sum that wouldn't balance. "It's nothing. It's nothing." "Then why are you down there on your knees over it?" the bride said. She'd come to the doorway. The lamp lit her from below and made her terrible, not beautiful, terrible, The way a thing is terrible when grief has burned everything soft off of it and left just the architecture. The derringer hung at her side now. She wasn't pointing it. She didn't need to. She'd understood, the way I'd understood, that the gun had stopped being the dangerous thing in the room. The dangerous thing was the black box, and the man on his knees in front of it, and what his shaking hands confessed that his mouth never would. 11 years you slept fine, she said to him, soft. You buried my brother and bought his water and built your white house and slept fine. And now there's a page of your own bookkeeping in a box and you can't make your hands work. She tilted her head, and it was so exactly the gesture he made, the auction tilt, the weighing, that I felt the hair go up on my arms again. She'd learned him. Across one day and 1,000 miles of imagining, she'd learned the man so well she'd started to move like him. You're afraid, after all this time. You're finally afraid, and it isn't of my gun. Her voice cracked just at the end. Daniel was afraid the night you came for him. I've thought about it every night for 11 years, how afraid he must have been, 19 years old, watching the fire come up the walls. I used to pray you'd feel it once before you died, just once. She let out a breath that shook. And here it is, and it's so much smaller than I thought it would be. The dial caught, the handle turned, the safe swung open. And Halloran's hand went in and came out with the ledger. The big black book I'd kept his accounts in for 11 years. Every honest number and every dishonest one, all in his own insisted-upon signing hand. And he had it. He had it in both arms against his chest. And there was a lamp not 3 feet from him on the desk. And all the long history of the Bar H had taught me one thing about Tobias Halloran above all others. He always burned the evidence. He lunged for the lamp. I was too far and too old, and my knee was gone. The bride was closer, but she'd have had to cross the whole room. Neither of us would have reached him. He'd have had the chimney off and the page in the flame in 2 seconds, and the only proof that a boy named Daniel Reese was murdered for water would have gone up the same way the boy did, and Halloran would have stood in the ashes of it and been, once more and forever, the richest man in 3 counties with nothing anyone could pin to him. He'd have made it. Except the lamp was the one the bride had carried in. The one on the desk had burned out hours back. Maria banked the stove and trimmed the wicks at nightfall, every night, 11 years running, and the desk lamp had been dry since supper. Halloran's hand closed on a cold, dead lamp with no flame in it. He'd reached for fire and found his own thrift. The banked stove, the trimmed wick, the small economies of a man who'd never in his life let a thing burn that didn't earn its burning. And in the half-second he stared at the dead lamp, not understanding. I crossed the last of the floor on a knee that screamed, and I took the ledger out of his arms. He let me. That's the thing I keep coming back to. At the end he let me take it. He could have fought, he was bigger than me, even old, even shaking. But something had gone out of him when the lamp came up cold in his hand, some engine that had run his whole life on the certainty that he could always burn his way clear. He knelt there on the floor of his own office with his empty arms still curved around the shape of the book that wasn't there anymore, and he looked up at me. And for the first and last time in 11 years, Tobias Halloran had nothing to say. The county seat is a long way, and the law out here is slow and bought as often as not, and I'll not pretend it went clean. It didn't. Halloran had 11 years and a white house and 3 counties worth of men who owed him, and the bride had a borrowed name and a borrowed dress, and a brother nobody but me remembered. He'd called that arithmetic on the porch, and he'd called it right. There was a season of it, lawyers, delays, a judge who'd hunted on Halloran's land. There were nights the bride and I sat in a rented room in the county seat with the ledger locked in a strongbox between us, certain it had all come to nothing, certain he'd buy his way out the way he'd bought his way into everything. But page 41 was in his own hand. That was the thing he couldn't buy back. He'd built his whole armor out of one honest habit. A man who won't put his name to his accounts is planning to lie about them, and the armor was the thing that sank him. The 2 hands who'd taken the hazard wages weren't both gone, it turned out. One had died, but the other was alive in Kansas and old and dying and tired of carrying it, the same way I'd been tired. And when a federal man went and showed him page 41 with his own mark on it, he talked. They always talk at the end, the tired ones. I'd have talked years sooner if anyone had thought to ask an old driver what he'd seen. I gave my word in a courtroom with my hat in my hands. I told about the coal oil smell and the late ride and the bonus called hazard wages. I told about 11 years of knowing and saying nothing, and I did not spare myself in the telling, because I'd promised the boy's sister one true thing, and a man may as well make it the whole truth while he's at it. The hardest part wasn't testifying against Halloran. The hardest part was saying out loud in front of the room that I'd taken my wage off that grass for 11 years and slept fine. Some of the people in that courtroom looked at me after like I was no better than him. They weren't wrong. I've made my peace with not being wholly right. They didn't hang Halloran. I'll be honest about that too. A rich old man with good lawyers doesn't hang for a fire 11 years cold, not in that county, not even with page 41. But the bar H came apart in the courts like a steer in a slaughter chute, claim by claim, water right by water right. Every acre that traced back to the Reese default tangled up in suits that'll outlive the lawyers. The White House with the St. Louis glass got sold to pay the fees. Last I heard he was living in 2 rooms in the county seat, a thin old man who'd been the richest in 3 counties, and the thing they say about him now is that his hands shake. They never used to. Now they shake all the time. The bride got her brother's name in the record. Daniel Reese, murdered fall of 1872. It's written down now in a county book in a clerk's tidy hand. It cost her 11 years and a wedding she never had, and a husband she never wanted, and 1 ball fired wide in the dark. And at the end of all of it, what she got was a line in a ledger, which is a small thing, and the only thing. And I watched her read it in the clerk's office, and I watched her hands shake the same way Halloran shook. And I understood that the 2 of them had been doing the same arithmetic from opposite ends the whole time, and it had cost them both everything, and neither one had won. She didn't stay. There was nothing to stay for. The grass wasn't hers and never would be. It went back into the courts, into the lawyers, into the slow machinery that doesn't give land back to the dead. She came by the cookhouse the morning she left. She'd put away the gray traveling dress. She was wearing the white one, the yellowed wedding dress, mended at the cuff in her own small stitches, because, she said, it was the only thing she'd brought worth wearing, and she'd be damned if she'd let it stay a thing of mourning. She'd wear it out the way you wear out anything you mean to keep. You could have let me shoot him, Cass, she said. She wasn't angry. She was past angry, the way she'd been past grief that first night on the porch. It would have been quicker. I'd have hanged, but Daniel would have been just as remembered, and I wouldn't have spent a year in a rented room watching that ledger. You'd have hanged, I said. Yes. And the boy who talked about apple trees wouldn't have wanted that. She looked at me a long moment. Then she did a thing I didn't expect. She reached into the flour sack and took out the dented brass daguerreotype, the one I'd found in the buckboard, Daniel laughing with his head tipped back, and she pressed it into my hand and folded my old fingers over it. You keep it, she said. You're the only one out here who knew his face was worth remembering. I've got him by heart. You're the one who'll forget if you don't have the picture. I tried to give it back. She wouldn't have it. Plant the apples, she said. If you ever get a patch of ground that's honestly yours. He'd have liked that somebody out here with apple trees who knew his name. And then the dry thing came back into her voice, the traveler from the stage, the woman who'd told me on the road that honesty was a misfortune in my line of work. It's a misfortune, remembering. I'd have warned you that first day if I'd known it would catch you too. She climbed up onto the stage at the bend in a dead boy's wedding dress, and she did not look back at the White House on the hill, because there was no one in it any more worth the turning of her head, and the stage rocked off over the rise the same way it had rocked in, and the same wind came off the flats carrying the same wet sage, and the same dust that gets in a man's teeth and stays there till supper. I never saw her again. I've got a patch of ground now, finally, honestly mine. A quarter section the court let me buy cheap out of the bar H wreckage, with a corner of the creek on it, the same water that cost a boy his life. I put in apple trees the first spring. They're slow. Apple trees are always slow. You plant them for somebody who comes after, which is the whole point of them, I've come to think. I keep the daguerreotype on the windowsill where the morning light gets it, and some mornings I take down my ledger. I still keep a ledger, 16 men and now a few more, and I think about adding a line for the boy, Daniel Reese, who liked apples, but I never have. He's already written down in the county book where it counts. My ledger's just for the ones nobody else remembered, and somebody at last remembered him. The trees blossomed this spring for the first time. White, the way apple blossom is white, the way a wedding dress is white, the way a thing can be white for a wedding or a burial, and you don't always get to choose which.